They didn't just trespass on my land. They ripped a trench straight through my grandfather's grave to build their luxury golf course pipeline. And I remember the dawn light on a raw dirt scar slicing through the wildflower meadow with the smell of diesel mixing with torn sagebrush roots. And that bronze plaque with Grandpa Thaddeus's name crushed flat in the dirt pile like a beer. And while the HOA president Vivian Strayud didn't even look up when I confronted her, just kept scrolling on her phone acrylic. Nails clicking on the screen, and when I told her she had desecrated a burial site, she laughed sharp and cold, and told me to show her a death certificate because ashes weren't legally interred. And in that moment, I knew she had made a fatal mistake, because I had spent 15 years dissecting water contracts in Denver District Court. And out here in Wyoming, whoever controls the water writes the rules, and 3 months later I own the creek feeding her entire gated community, because eminent domain works both ways, so let me tell you how it happened. My name is Marlo Coltrane, but everyone calls me Marley, and 3 years ago, I inherited 240 acres of high desert rangeland in Fremont County, Wyoming, that my grandfather Thaddeus had homesteaded in 1948, when he came back from the war with nothing but a duffel bag and a land grant. And he built everything from scratch: the house, the barn, the windmill that still cacks in the wind. And he was 1/4 Shoshone. Knew this land like music. He knew where the springs ran underground, which pastures flooded in April, where the soil remembered old buffalo trails. And when I was 9, he taught me to read survey maps at the kitchen table, his calloused finger tracing property lines. And he would say, "Land doesn't lie, Marley, people do." And when he died in 2019, I scattered his ashes in the southeast pasture near a cottonwood grove with no formal burial, just me, the wind, and the meadowlarks at sunrise. 15-year career as a water rights paralegal in Denver, and a divorce that left me broken. I sold my practice, cashed out my 401k, and came home to rehabilitate the ranch with rotational grazing, native grass restoration, and a small beef CSA. And it healed me until Ridgemont Estates happened in spring 2023, when I spotted orange survey stakes cutting straight through Thaddeus's grove every 50 feet. And at the county clerk's office, I discovered they had filed for private condemnation 6 weeks earlier, sending notice to a P.O. box I had closed 2 years back. Classic dirty trick. In Ridgemont is a gated community 3 miles east, built on former BLM land, with an artificial lake, an 18-hole golf course, and McMansions, starting at $850,000 in a desert where we get 12 inches of rain a year. And their golf course alone used more water than 40 family ranches combined, pulling it from Clearstone Reservoir, which was built in 1963 for agricultural irrigation, and now they wanted a dedicated pipeline straight through my land, claiming an obscure statute that allowed condemnation if no economically viable alternative existed, which was garbage, because they could have routed it along County Road for a couple $100,000 more, but they preferred to steamroll. And the woman orchestrating all this was Vivian Strayud, a retired pharma VP who drove a white Lexus with vanity plates, and the construction schedule was posted right there in their marble-floored clubhouse, with the start date circled Monday, May 8th, giving me 3 days. So I tried confronting her, and she mocked me. And when I walked out to the Cottonwood Grove Friday evening, I saw the orange fence surrounding acres of wildflowers and survey lines slashing right through the place. I had scattered Thaddeus's ashes, and I cried for 5 minutes, then called Hector Ruiz, my old Denver colleague, who specialized in water law, and told him I needed an emergency injunction. Because Vivian assumed I would roll over, but she did not know I had spent 15 years finding loopholes in contracts. And in Wyoming, water law is full of trapdoors, and Hector drafted a TTRO citing improper notice and the Native American Graves Protection Act, since Thaddeus's Shoshone heritage might qualify for federal protection. And I pulled his old land patent discharge papers and enrollment forms from the attic late into the night, while coyotes yipped outside and Hector filed Sunday afternoon. And Judge Vernon Kemp, a 4th-generation rancher who hated corporate overreach, agreed to hear us Monday. And I thought maybe we had a chance, but Vivian arrived with 3 attorneys from the most aggressive firm in Jackson Hole, and they argued there were no marked graves on the database, that Shoshone enrollment was jurisdictionally irrelevant, and then delivered the kill shot that Ridgemont had already begun excavation Friday evening before the injunction existed. And the judge looked pained, but ruled against me, saying I could appeal with a $75,000 bond money I did not have. And when I walked out of the courthouse, Vivian gave me that tight smile of victory. And by the time I got home, the backhoe was already tearing into the cottonwood roots, and the foreman handed me Thaddeus's bronze plaque bent and caked in mud and apologized quietly before ordering his crew to continue, and I sat in my truck shaking until I saw the survey map and noticed Ridgemont's water source was Clearstone. Reservoir allocated by the Fremont Watershed District, not owned outright, and that meant contracts and renewal terms, so I dug through county files and found a 1987 bylaw requiring any private entity using more than 500 acre-feet annually to renegotiate every 10 years or prove conservation infrastructure, and Ridgemont's golf course used 620 acre-feet per year according to their own reports, and their last renewal was 2014, meaning they were overdue, and failure to renew meant they could lose their rights completely. So I photocopied the bylaw and realized Vivian thought she had won. But she had opened the door for me to take everything. And when she struck back by blasting an email to 2,200 homeowners, painting me as a selfish obstructionist, my phone lit up with hate calls and threats. And someone even cut 40 feet of my fence, sending my cattle onto County Road, costing me $1,200 in impound fees. And then her lawyers hit me with a $250,000 countersuit for delays, a classic slap suit, designed to bankrupt me, and I only had $22,000 left in savings, and I nearly collapsed under the pressure. But I kept digging into records and found that Ridgemont fell under the private domestic allocation category, which was only 10% of Clearstone's water, yet their golf course used more than all other private users combined. And then I traced the watershed board and found 7 members, 6 honest ranchers and small-town officials, and 1 Dalton Strayud, who had voted yes on every rid. Gemont expansion and never disclosed that Vivian was his sister, and failing to disclose family ties was a massive violation, opening the board to liability and triggering state investigation. And when I called Hector, he said, "Jesus, Marley, that's grounds for an investigation, and every allocation Dalton touched could be frozen." And I smiled for the first time in weeks, because Vivian thought she had her brother pulling strings, but she didn't know I had just cut the strings, and I needed allies, so I called Iris Pendleton, a retired hydrologist who had fought overallocation for decades, and when I showed her Ridgemont's numbers, she agreed to model how much water they were stealing and promised to testify. And then I brought the documents to reporter Tyrell Booker, who had exposed fracking abuses, and he saw the conflict of interest and the expired allocations, and the financial bombshell. Ridgemont had hidden a $4.2 million bond, collateralized on uninterrupted water service, meaning if they lost water, the bank could foreclose on every amenity, and property values would crater, and Vivian had never told her residents any of it. And Tyrell said this is page 1 material. And I started speaking at rancher meetings and found quiet allies who had also been harassed and reassessed by Ridgemont. And they pledged testimony and support, and suddenly I was no longer fighting alone. And as summer burned hotter and Clearstone Reservoir dropped lower, Iris explained that it was fed mostly by Antler Creek. Once part of the Drummond Ranch sold in 2019 to a California LLC that never developed the land, but the family had retained senior water rights dating back to 1904, which gave them first claim in drought years. And I checked the state engineer's database and found those rights would expire August 15th unless renewed. And when I contacted the LLC, they admitted they were liquidating and would sell the rights for $80,000 just to clear the books, and I only had 22. But I realized if I could find the money, those rights would give me control of 35% of Clearstone's inflow and legally allow me to cut Ridgemont off completely, because in the West, senior rights trump junior allocations. And when I told Hector, he said just owning them gives you leverage because nobody will dare cross someone who can turn off the tap. But I was ready to use them if I had to, because after the harassment, the lawsuits, the trespass, and the desecration, I was done playing nice. And I thought about the hate mail and the threats and the silence of meadowlarks at Thaddeus's grove. And I knew that if I could buy those rights, Ridgemont's empire of marble and golf greens would dry up like the desert it pretended not to be. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to peace, because I had the law, the land, the water, and the memory of my grandfather all on my side, and Vivian Strayud had no idea that the rancher she thought she could bury was about to own the source of her entire community's survival.